Hello guys, welcome to another day here for the Advent of Cyber, day 9. Here we're going to be talking about GRC. 9 o'clock, make GRC fun, tell no one. Okay, alright, let me zoom in properly here. So we see Max Kiddy and Glitch wants to hire an e-discovery company to process some forensic data for their investigation. They have invited bids from third parties for this purpose. 3 companies have bid for the project, and Max Kiddy and Glitch now need to do a risk assessment on all 3 of these companies to identify the one with the least amount of risk so they can, move forward. Now, all these 3 companies were required to fill out a questionnaire based on which risk assessment will be done, and from there they can come to a conclusion on which company they can hire. But before we go into assessing them, we need to understand some basic terminologies. Now, what is GRC? Now, it stands for governance, risk, and compliance. It plays a crucial role in any organization to ensure that their security practices align with the personal, regulatory, and legal obligations. Although in general, good security practices help protect a business from suffering a breach. Depending on the sector in which the organization operates in, or there may be an external security regulation that it needs to adhere to. Now, it's just like the reserve bank, they have their rules they follow. They also have data protections that they need to stand. So this basically, every organization have some standard rules, international or bodies that they need to adhere to in order to protect people's information or to prevent losses when it comes to security. Okay, it is obvious that when you run a large organization with multiple different teams. How do you stay on top of all these regulations and ensure that good security is applied by all the team? This is where GRC comes into play. Now let's understand what is governance. Governance is like the function that creates the framework that an organization uses to make that decision regarding information security. So governance is like the function that creates that particular framework. Now, what is compliance? Compliance is now like the function that ensures that these organizations adheres to all the external legal, regulatory, and industrial standards. So, making them to adhere to these laws is what we call compliance. Now let's understand introduction to risk assessment. Now, before Skiddy and Glitch choose an e-discovery company to handle their forensic data, they need to figure out which one is the safest choice. This is where risk assessment comes into play. It is a process of identifying potential problems before they occur. Think of it as checking the weather before going for your hike. You don't want to go when there's a storm, or you don't want to go out when it's raining. So now, why are these risk assessments done? Risk assessments are likely to are like a reality check for businesses. They connect cybersecurity to the bigger picture, which minimizes business risk. In other words, it's not just about securing data, but about protecting the business as a whole. Now, so imagine if you run an online store that collects customer information like names, address, and credit card details. If that data gets stolen because of weak security, it is not just the data that's at risk. Your reputation, customer trust, and even your profits are on the line. So a risk assessment could have helped you to identify this weak point and fix it before anything could have went wrong. Alright, so in this case, that's why Maskidi and Glitch are assessing the risks of each e-discovery company, helps them to decide which one is less likely to have a data breach or other issues that could disrupt their investigation. Now, performing a risk assessment. Every business main goal is to generate revenue and profit. Now, for most businesses, cybersecurity does not directly contribute to the revenue generation or profit maximization. Businesses decide to spend part of their hard-earned revenue on cybersecurity to avoid the risk of revenue or reputation loss resulting from a cyber threat. Now, businesses often take these steps to achieve this goal. Now, we will now walk through the processes of completing a risk register. A risk register tracks the process of risk mitigation and all open risks. Now, an example of such a risk register is shown in the animation below. Okay, an important of a risk register is what this is how it looks like, where you can check the description of the risk, likelihood of realization, the impact, the risk score, and the risk score. Now, we're going to see these terms here soon, so we can understand how to use a risk register. So first, let's talk about identification of risk. In order to assess risk, we must first identify the factor that can cause revenue or reputational loss resulting from cyber threats. This exercise requires carefully assessing the attack surface of the organization and identifying areas which might be used to harm the organization. Example of identified risk can be an unpatched web server, a high privileged user account without proper security controls, a third-party vendor who might be affected or infected by a malware connecting to the organization's network, and lastly, like a system for which support has ended by the vendor and it's still in production. Very risky. Now, an organization might identify several other risks in addition to these examples. However, in addition to just identifying risk, these risks also need to be quantified. After all, the likelihood of materializing a risk on a condoned off an isolated server differs greatly from that of a public-facing server hosting a web frontline. Okay, and similarly, the impact of risk materializing a crown jewel, such as a main database server containing confidential information, would definitely be different from that of a server used for development with dummy data. Now, assigning likelihood to each risk. Now, to quantify risk, we need to identify how likely or probable it is that the risk will materialize. We can then assign a number to quantify this likelihood. Now, this number is often on a scale of 1 to 5. The exact scale differ from organization to organization and from framework to framework. Likelihood can also be called the probability of materialization of a risk. An example could be improbable, which means unlikely that it might ever happen. Remote, very unlikely to happen, but still there's a possibility. Occasional, likely to happen once on some time. Probable, likely to happen several times, and frequent, likely to happen often and regularly. Now, it might be noticed that while we are trying to quantify the risk, we still don't define exact quantities of what constitutes several times and what constitutes regularly. So the reason is that the likelihood for a server which has a very high uptime requirement will be different from a server that is used infrequently, definitely. Therefore, the likelihood scale will differ from case to case and from asset to asset. And now on the flip side, we can see that this scale provides us with a very usable scale of differentiating between different probabilities of occurrence of a certain event. Okay. Now, assigning impact to each risk. Now, once we have identified the risk and the likelihood of a risk, the next step is to quantify the impact this risk materialization might have on the organization. For example, if there is a public-facing web server that is unpatched and gets breached, what will be the impact on the organization? Now, different organizations calculate impact in different ways. Some organizations might use the CVSS score, which is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. They might be using that score to calculate the impact of the risk. Others might use their own rating derived from confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of a certain asset. And others might base it on the severity categorization of the event. Similar to likelihood, we also quantify impact, often on a scale of 1 to 5. An example scale of impact can be based on the following definitions. One is informational, very low impact, almost non-existent. Low, impacting a limited part of one of area of the organization, not all, with little to no revenue loss. Medium, impacting one part of the organization's operations completely with major revenue loss. High, is definitely impacting several parts of the organization's operations, causing significant revenue loss. And lastly is the critical, which is posing an existential threat to the organization. Now, what is risk ownership? Now, the last step to perform a risk assessment is to decide what to do with the risk that we found. We can start by performing some calculations on the risk itself. The simplest calculation takes the likelihood of the risk and multiplies it with the impact of the risk to get a score. Some risk register makes use of more advanced rating systems, such like DREAD. The DREAD is a system used by Microsoft to assess risks to computer security threats. And assigning scores to the risks help organizations prioritize which risk should be remediated first. Okay. Now, in the last step, we decide who owns the risk that we identified. These team members are then responsible for performing an additional investigation into what the cost would be to close the risk versus what we could lose if the risk is realized. Now, in cases where the cost of the security is lower, we can mitigate the risk with more security controls. However, where it is higher, we can accept the risk. Now, accepted risk should always be documented and reviewed periodically to ensure that the cost has not changed. Now, lastly, here we're going to look at internal and third-party risk assessments. Risk assessments are not just done internally in an organization, but can also be used to assess the risks that a third party may hold on that particular organization. Now, today it is very common to make use of third parties to outsource your functions. Like a company might outsource their financial division to a large auditing firm, they might outsource their security to a security firm, or their software development to a software development firm. So in this case, now you should know, ask yourself, why do this company need internal risk assessment? Because internal risk assessment help companies to understand the risks they have within their own walls. Okay, for example, if a company finds that the software is outdated, it can prioritize updating it to prevent potential attacks. Internal risk assessments help to identify weak spots in the security, direct resources to the most important areas, and stay compliant with security rules and regulations. Okay, and the reason why we would want to have our companies do assessment for third parties is we need to evaluate risks that comes from working with other companies like vendors, suppliers, or partners. This is called third party risk assessment, and it is important because one weak link in the chain can affect everyone. Now, let's make it simple. Masquidi and Glitch wants to make sure that whichever e-discovery company they choose won't leak or lose sensitive data. So they will be reviewing if these companies, one, have a good security measure to keep data safe, follow data protection rules, aligned with the security standard that Masquidi and Glitch have in place. Now, by doing a third-party risk assessment, Masquidi and Glitch are reducing potential supply chain risks, making sure the investigation doesn't run into double trouble or run into trouble because of a weak security link in the chain. And in order to do this, Masquidi has to create a risk assessment that can be sent to the potential third parties. Based on the answers provided by the third parties, Masquidi can then make an informed decision on which third party would be best. Now, procuring a partner, let's put this knowledge into test, and let's start the static site attached to this start by pressing the view site button below. You will have to assess the level of the risk that each of the vendors pose. We sent a questionnaire to each potential third party and have received the answers. Now, we're going to be using these answers to add new risks to the risk register, which will give an overall risk score for each third party. Once done, we can choose the third party that has the lowest risk score. Alright, let's quickly start that. Okay, instructions: you'll be assessing this true vendor based on the responses to the security questions for each vendor. Number one, review the vendor's response for each security question. Number two, identify potential risk based on their responses and add them to the risk register. And three, for each risk, provide a clear description of the risk. Rate the impact 1 to 4, where 4 is the highest. Rate the likelihood 1 to 4, where 4 is the highest. And then number 4 here says the risk score is automatically calculated by multiplying the impact versus likelihood. And the vendor's risk score is the sum of all risk score for that vendor. Your goal is to identify the vendor with the lowest total risk scores. Got it. Now we do have vendor 1, Obsidian Panther. We also have Ruby and so on. So we'll start with the first person, and let's click on question 1. It has 3 questions, and then we can rate the impact level and likelihood. Okay, so we'll start with question 1. Data in transit and data at rest needs to be encrypted with AES encryption as a requirement for this project. What type of AES encryption does your company use for data in transit and data at rest? Now over here it says none for data at rest and none for data in transit. Well, data at rest can also lead to data breach. When there's a data breach, it could compromise the data, as well as data in transit could be sniffed, and if it's not encrypted, it could be decrypted, or if it's not encrypted, it could be easily seen or taken advantage of. So in this case, we can say data at rest is likely to be lead or likely exposed to data breach, right? And data in transit could be sniffed. In this case, I'll rate the impact level to be very critical, or let's say high. It's very high, and the likelihood in this case, it's possible. Let's say at risk, and assessment needs to review. We can click here to adjust it. So let's say high and likely. At risk, say assessment could be improved. Your assessment indicate lower than expected. In this case, I would say the impact level could be critical then. Because yes, the impact level could be critical because none of the data is encrypted at rest and in transit, and it's likely to occur. So at risk, okay, looks like it is also very likely to occur. So at risk, assessment could be improved, I think. Okay, how about likely and then, or very likely to occur, and put it on high. Okay, perfect assessment then. Okay. Alright then, question 2 says, what kind of access control do you have to ensure data is accessed only by authorized people? Data can be accessed by all the people on the relevant team. Well, that looks like insider threat could also occur here when too many people inside have access to some specific data. So insider threat can lead to, let's say it can lead to compromise, can lead to data breach. I just put it that way. And the likely, it's a critical thing when you lose data in such a way, and the likelihood is it's likely to occur. So let's add risk. It says assessment could be, your assessment indicates high risks than anticipated. Okay, so let's edit that and let's put the impact level to be high and maybe very likely at risk. Your assessment indicate high risk than it indicated, so high and then likely. Good assessment, we need a perfect assessment. Is it unlikely? Let's say unlikely then. At risk, assessment needs review. Your assessment indicates significant lower risk, then it should be possible then. I just put this as possible. This is actually subjective, so at risk, it says good assessment. It's critical then possible. Perfect. Okay, critical then possible. Alright, then lastly here for question 3 here, how long do you keep client data after the case is closed? 1 week to 2 weeks. Even at that, 1 week to 2 weeks, we still have data can be breached at rest. So data is exposed at rest and can lead to data breach or something like that. Just putting something there. Breach. Am I spelling that correctly? Alright, with that said, we could actually say this is quite critical because these are people's information, and the likelihood is could very much likely occur. No, let's just say it is unlikely within 1 to 2 weeks that something like that could happen. So at risk, assessment could be improved. Your assessment indicate lower risk than anticipated, so let's say possible. Yeah, so we're done with our assessment here. We all got perfect assessment for all of them, so we can complete our assessment and head on to second vendor. It's similar questions. Question 1, for them they said none for the data in transit, and AES for data at rest. So in this case, I might want to say data in transit can undergo network sniffing, and data at rest is fine, but let's just put network sniffing can occur for data in transit. So let's put it that way, and this is high. and usually likely to occur. At risk, perfect. Okay, question number 2. Data can be accessed by all the people on the relevant team and global administrators. So we could have insider threats leading to data breach, and it can also be compromised when even authorized by some people. So let's say insider threat can lead to data breach, and data can be compromised when authorized to certain people. In this case, we can just set it to critical because it's data exposure, and usually this is likely to occur. Add to that, and perfect. Lastly, here we have how long do you keep client data after the case is closed? More than 1 month. Oosh. Data at rest could lead to rest when it undergoes breach, could lead to huge data breach. So in this case, it's very critical and very likely to occur as well. Okay, perfect. We've done all the assessment for the tree, and we had perfect assessment. Complete our assessment, and then we head to the last one, Scarlet Eagle. Question 1, none for the data in transit, and AES250 for the data at rest. More like the reverse of the other person, the other company. So in this case, data can be captured, data can be sniffed on transit. Okay, data can be sniffed on transit, and even the data at rest can be decrypted as well for AES256, and data can be decrypted after capture. So in this case, we can say captured. Am I spelling that correctly? Yes. In this case, we can call this quite a high risk, but usually is it unlikely to happen or possible? Let's say possible. Your assessment indicate lower risk than anticipated, so unlikely. Okay, that means it's likely to really occur. High and likely. Perfect assessment. Great. Question 2. What kind of access control do you have do you have to ensure data is accessed by authorized people? Data can be accessed by all the people on the relevant team. In this case, we could actually say there could be an insider threat, and I'll just type it, just an insider threat equals to data breach. Okay, in this case, we could actually say it's a very critical situation, but it's unlikely to occur. Let's say possible. Is it likely, unlikely? It's a likely to occur, at risk. Okay, let's just put possible. Okay, perfect. And then lastly, for question 3, how long do you keep client data after the case is closed? 2 weeks to 1 month. That is still much. A lot can occur within that period. A data breach can occur within that period. A data breach, sorry, I don't know if I'm even spelling this breach correctly. Data breach can occur in that period. So it's actually very critical, and as also is it unlikely? Let's add that and see if it's unlikely. No, it's likely to really occur in that duration. In that duration, let's put it possible in enter. Okay, more like likely. Is it likely? Likely then, and add risk, and that should be perfect now. Okay, we complete our assessment, and here it has done the calculations for us. Scroll down to this point, you see our risk assessment score. We have 28, 37, and 29. Ooh, this was close tie, yeah. So in this case, we're going to be selecting Obsidian Panther as our result, and let's see. Yes, we have our flag, so we can just copy that flag, and we're going to answer our questions here, which is Let me close this first. Okay. Alright, let's answer the questions. I already copied the flag we received after performing this. And what does GRC stand for? Governance. Governance. R stands for what? Just skipped my mind. Risk, and C is compliance. So we can come over here and actually copy it from here. Governance, risk, and compliance. Copy that. You can scroll down to the end here. It's governance, risks, and compliance separated with commas. So just take this and off, and with this you submit. Correct. What is the flag you received after performing the risk assessment? You submit. That's the flag we got. And lastly, if you enjoyed this task, feel free to check out the risk management room, complete that, and voila. That brings us to the end of day 9 GRC. It was a fun room. Thank you guys for studying with me. Thank you guys for learning with me, and I'll see you guys for the next day. And day what? That will be day 10. And do enjoy the rest of your day. Ciao.